Augustus is one of the most powerful and complex figures in Roman history. He opened the door to the final, most devastating phase of the civil wars, but became the founder of a lasting world peace that was honored with the name Pax Augusta. The bringer of peace was also a conqueror, leading many wars over 40 years and expanding the borders of the Roman Empire more than any Roman before or after him. He was the grave digger of the dying Roman Republic, yet he took the greatest satisfaction in the honors he received for giving back the res publica, the Roman state, to the Senate and the people of Rome, after wielding almost absolute power himself. Augustus began his career as a high-ranking traitor, and yet ended it as the father of the nation. Early on, he trampled on law and order, but later restored them, creating a system that both he and probably most of his contemporaries saw as the best and happiest state of the Roman Republic. To characterize his position in this new order, Augustus called himself princeps, meaning the first or leading man of the state. This term had roots in the Roman Republic, where the leading group of senators was known as the principes civitatis, or the leading men of the citizenry. By monopolizing this title for himself, Augustus, perhaps unintentionally, revealed the shift that had occurred from a collective leadership to a single, dominant figure. In line with this self-description, we are used to calling the new Roman state established by Augustus the Principate. This form of government kept the old republican institutions intact, but hid the reality that Augustus had all the power. An even clearer look at the real foundations of his rule is seen in the title Imperator, Commander, a title Augustus officially used from 40 BC onward in place of his first name. Though Augustus was far from a great military general, he was hailed as Imperator 21 times during his life. This title pointed to his special relationship with the soldiers and the army, a relationship that gave him his power. He inherited the army's loyalty from his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, and used it as a tool to acquire and maintain power. In modern European languages, the title Imperator and the family name Caesar became synonymous with monarchy, denoting the highest rank in royal circles. Although Augustus's early career was that of a military despot, he managed to rid himself of the dangers that the militarization of Roman politics had created during the late Republic. The path Augustus took from a high-ranking traitor to a celebrated father of the nation was not the result of a master plan he had from the beginning. In 44 BC, he could not have foreseen where his decision to accept the inheritance of the dictator Caesar would lead him. Born on September 23, 63 BC, as Gaius Octavius in Rome, Augustus grew up in a family from Velitrae, a town located on the southern slopes of the Alban Hills. The family was originally from the equestrian class, a wealthy but not aristocratic group. His paternal grandfather lived a long and quiet life as a rich local official. Augustus's father was the first in the family to seek a political career in Rome, rising to the position of questor, a first step in the Roman political system, and securing a lifelong seat in the Senate. However, Augustus's father died suddenly in 59 BC, when Augustus was still a boy. His mother, Attia, remarried a year later to Lucius Marcius Philippus, a man who became consul in 56 BC. It was in his stepfather's house that Augustus spent much of his early life. His biological father left him a large fortune, and his family connections through his mother linked him to two of Rome's most famous figures, Pompey and Julius Caesar. In fact, Julius Caesar was Augustus's great-uncle. At the time Augustus was born, Pompey had expanded Rome's control over vast territories in the east, from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. Meanwhile, in Italy, the great orator Cicero had just defeated an armed revolt led by a disgruntled politician, Catiline. Political and social unrest was common in Rome, with tensions between the rich and poor growing ever wider. It was during this turbulent time that young Gaius Octavius began his childhood. While his stepfather Philippus remained politically neutral, carefully avoiding taking sides, young Octavius was increasingly drawn into Caesar's orbit. In 51 BC, when Julius Caesar was finishing his conquest of Gaul, Octavius delivered a funeral oration for his grandmother, a sign of the important role he would soon play in Caesar's family. By the time he turned 15 in 48 BC, Octavius donned the toga virilis, symbolizing his entry into manhood, and was named a member of the priestly college of the Pontifices, a major honor granted by Caesar himself. Octavius continued his education, learning about Greek and Latin literature while studying to become a skilled public speaker. His talents impressed Caesar, who soon began to prepare him for a more significant role. In Caesar's final will, written in September 45 BC, the dictator named Octavius as his primary heir and adopted him as his son. If Caesar had no legitimate son of his own, Octavius would inherit Caesar's fortune and political legacy. However, in March 44 BC, everything changed. While Octavius was staying in the Greek city of Apollonia, preparing to join Caesar on a campaign in the east, news arrived that Caesar had been assassinated by a group of senators in Rome on the Ides of March. The dictator was dead, and Octavius's future, as Caesar's heir, was thrown into uncertainty. At first, Octavius's family, including his mother and stepfather, advised him to avoid Rome and steer clear of danger. But Octavius, even as a young man of 18, showed his determination and courage. He made the dangerous journey back to Rome, where he declared his intention to claim Caesar's inheritance and take on the name Gaius Julius Caesar, adopting his great-uncle's legacy. The situation in Rome was chaotic. Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, hoped to restore the Republic, while Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies, sought to control Caesar's political machinery. Octavius soon found himself in a dangerous rivalry with Antony, as both men sought to win over Caesar's supporters, including the legions of soldiers loyal to him. Octavius played his cards carefully. Using Caesar's fortune, he paid generous legacies to the Roman people and Caesar's veterans, gaining their loyalty. He also shrewdly used propaganda to strengthen his position as Caesar's rightful heir. By the summer of 44 BC, Octavius had positioned himself as a major player in Roman politics, even though he held no official position. Antony, realizing the threat Octavius posed, attempted to sideline him, but Octavius proved more resourceful than anyone expected. In 43 BC, he joined forces with two of Caesar's former allies, Mark Antony and Lepidus, to form the Second Triumvirate, a powerful alliance that allowed them to defeat Caesar's assassins and take control of the Roman state. The victory over Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC solidified Octavius's position, but tensions within the triumvirate soon flared up. By 31 BC, Octavius and Antony were locked in a final confrontation for control of Rome. The climactic battle came at Actium, where Octavius's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra, leading to their suicide. With his rivals dead, Octavius was the undisputed master of the Roman world. But rather than declare himself dictator or king, he took a different approach. In 27 BC, he officially restored the Republic, returning power to the Senate and people. In reality, though, he retained control behind the scenes, with command of the army and ultimate authority over the state. He took the name Augustus, meaning the revered one, marking the start of a new era. As Augustus, he ruled for more than 4 decades, during which he expanded the empire's borders, secured Rome's frontiers, and initiated reforms that brought about a long period of peace and stability. Augustus was celebrated as the bringer of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that lasted for centuries. His reign marked the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. In the end, Augustus's legacy is that of a man who rose from the chaos of civil war to become Rome's first emperor, leaving a lasting mark on the world. He was both a destroyer and a builder, a man who brought an end to the Republic while creating a new order that would endure for centuries. His name became synonymous with power, and his life's work shaped the course of Western history. The sources mention over 60 participants, but only 27 of them are known by name. Some, like Cicero, might have been falsely accused. Many were in the East, and the most prominent of them, Marcus Brutus and Cassius, held high military commands. Due to their positions, they were technically immune from prosecution while they were in office. However, the young consul wasn't interested in a fair trial. The law made him the judge in the case, and it also allowed him to pick the jury. It's said that the jurors were eager to please their new ruler, hoping to gain significant advantages. All but one of the jurors declared the defendants guilty. The death sentences handed down couldn't be carried out, as the court couldn't capture the accused. They were declared outlaws, stripped of their civil rights, which included the special commands given to them by the Senate to fight the enemies of Caesar. It was only natural that Octavian also overturned the Senate's decrees that had declared Antony and Lepidus enemies of the state. He then began negotiations to form a new power alliance with them. This alliance freed Octavian from his dangerous isolation, but the power balance between the three leaders was uneven. Octavian had to accept the role of junior partner for now. In late October 43 BCE, the agreement was made on a small island in the river Rhenus near Bologna. Octavian agreed to pass the consulship to Publius Ventidius, a follower of Caesar. The three allies wanted to rule with extraordinary powers for 5 years, during which time they would have dictatorial authority to restore order to the state. Each of them was assigned a province, which they could govern through their appointed deputies. Antony, the most powerful of the three, received the most important military provinces, both Gaul on this side of the Alps and the land Caesar had conquered across the Alps, as well as Spain and the region of Narbonensis. Octavian, on the other hand, was given a lesser role for now, with promises of future power. He received North Africa and the western islands of Sicily and Sardinia. However, these islands were controlled by Sextus Pompeius, whose fleet dominated the western seas. In North Africa, the key province was under the control of Quintus Cornificius, who refused to hand it over. In Rome and Italy, the triumvirs wanted to eliminate their political opponents in preparation for the upcoming civil war. To avoid panic among the public, they planned to release the list of their intended victims only when the time was right. To ensure their safety while fighting the murderers of Caesar, they arranged for all executive magistrates to be elected for 5 years in advance. They also agreed to track down and kill prominent opponents in a preemptive strike without needing any legal permission. One of the people targeted for this assassination was Cicero, whom Antony saw as a sworn enemy. Even if Octavian had wanted to, he couldn't have saved his former ally. On December 7th, Cicero was captured while trying to flee. His head was displayed on the rostra in the Roman Forum, the place where the great orator had once celebrated his triumphs. On November 27, the tribune Publius, acting on behalf of the three rulers, had the agreement of Polonia officially ratified by the People's Assembly. Their collective dictatorship and their planned campaign of murder and confiscation were now fully legal. It's said that around 300 senators and 2,000 members of the opposition were affected by this campaign. Soldiers' squads, especially small ones, took the lead in hunting down the condemned. This was a time when strategies of survival, hiding, and disguises became vital. Alongside human cruelty and betrayal, loyalty and courage triumphed as well. Those who survived the initial wave of persecution often had a good chance of being pardoned later and recovering part of their wealth. As for the war against Caesar's murderers, the triumvir's plan was for Lepidus to control Italy with 3 legions, while the other 2 moved the main army to the east to decide the war on the battlefield. Before that, however, Octavian was tasked with taking control of Africa and eliminating the threat posed by Sextus Pompeius and his fleet operating from Sicily. The conquest of Africa succeeded, but the Sicilian expedition failed. Caesar's murderers had spent the year gathering all the resources from the east for their final battle. They were particularly ruthless in their financial exploitation, especially Cassius, but the assassins hadn't counted on the ingenuity and daring of Antony. On October 23rd, Antony won a hard-fought battle at Philippi against the forces of Cassius. After this decisive victory, the 2 victors, Antony and Octavian, renegotiated their power. Lepidus, whose conduct in Rome had been questioned and who had allegedly started negotiations with Sextus Pompeius, was punished. He had to give up Spain to Octavian. Antony kept most of the remaining legions and took control of the east, where he was tasked with restoring justice to the provinces that had been oppressed by Caesar's murderers. Antony gained control of the richest provinces of the Roman Empire, allowing him to build a powerful client base similar to Pompey's. Octavian, meanwhile, was left with the contentious task of settling 50,000 to 60,000 demobilized soldiers on lands taken from Roman citizens. Much of this land was located in the fertile plains of northern Italy, a region that had been part of the Gallic province but was now incorporated into Italy. Antony promised to financially support the settlement of veterans using taxes from the eastern provinces. This meant that Octavian depended on Antony's goodwill to carry out this task. Octavian's position was unenviable. The agreement between the triumvirs had been announced to the soldiers, who knew that 18 cities with extensive farmland were set aside for distribution. Only in a few cases would exceptions be made to spare landowners. When Octavian returned to Rome, he was immediately besieged by landowners pleading to be spared from the confiscations. But the veterans, fully aware that Octavian and the triumvirs needed their support, didn't wait for the formal allocation process. They simply seized the best land they could find by force. Further south, the poet Horace shared the fate of many younger officers after the Battle of Philippi. He had fought on the side of Brutus, but survived the battle. Upon returning to Italy, he found that his family's estate in Venusia had been confiscated. Later, Horace would wryly remark that poverty drove him to the boldness of writing verses. Another young poet, Virgil, narrowly avoided the loss of his family's property, according to biographical accounts. Octavian, acting on the advice of influential patrons, supposedly saved him from eviction. The chaos caused by the soldiers' lawlessness led to a political crisis, sparking a new civil war. This war did not yet resolve the rivalry between Antony and Octavian, but it set the stage for Octavian to emerge as the stronger figure. Antony, meanwhile, still held significant military power in the east. The alliance between the two began to fray, and a final showdown seemed inevitable. Octavian's path to becoming the sole ruler of the Roman Empire had begun. They lured the legate Lucius Aemilius into an ambush and killed him along with the soldiers accompanying him. In response, the Romans launched a scorched earth campaign, but even then, the conquest of the mountainous northwest, later unconquerable by both Muslim armies and Napoleon, was not yet complete. When Agrippa went to the western provinces in the years 9–11, he had to suppress a new uprising. Agrippa also faced significant difficulties with his soldiers, who were demoralized by the harshness of the guerrilla warfare. Only after restoring discipline did he achieve his goal. The mountain fortresses were taken one by one, and the surviving population was resettled in the plains. The campaign Augustus had started in Spain in 26 BCE, therefore, lasted 7 years with interruptions. The result was that all of Spain was now under Roman control, and peace prevailed, though in the northwest it may have initially been the peace of the graveyard. Augustus then secured the crucial road connection from northern Italy to Gaul by establishing a veteran colony called Colonia Augusta, now known as Aosta. Even while still in Spain, he authorized the prefect of Egypt, Gaius Aelius Gallus, to lead a combined sea and land expedition to southern Arabia, today's Yemen. The goal was to control the lucrative trade with India, particularly the incense trade. However, this military adventure ended in disaster. A large part of the army perished during the long march, succumbing to heat, water shortages, and disease. Pressured by the Arabs, the Romans were forced to retreat. Overall, the military events of 26 to 24 BCE probably disappointed the high imperial expectations of the Roman public. Augustus did not return to Rome in 24 BCE as a shining war hero. From Tarraco, Augustus had engaged in wide-ranging governance that turned this provincial capital into a second center of the empire, alongside Rome. Through this, he made it clear to the magistrates and the Senate that the consular constitution had not truly been restored, despite appearances in January 27 BCE. In all major matters, Augustus made the decisions, and in Rome, the other consul was dependent on his approval. Moreover, Augustus had appointed a city prefect to control the capital. He chose a prominent follower, Marcus Valerius Messala Corvinus, who had a turbulent political past. Originally a supporter and admirer of Caesar's assassin Cassius, Messala had joined Antony after Philippi. But when Antony's dominance in the west collapsed, Messala shifted his allegiance to Octavian. The office of city prefect had previously been just an honorary position given to young men for one day, during the festival of the Latin Games. But now, the city prefect was meant to represent Augustus in Rome and govern the city, despite the presence of a consul, which was wholly incompatible with the supposedly restored consular constitution. Messala Corvinus resigned from the post after only a few days, seemingly unsure how to wield such an unprecedented position of power. Meanwhile, Augustus began promoting his only male blood relative, his nephew Marcus Claudius Marcellus, born in 42 BCE. Marcellus had accompanied Augustus to Spain, and in 25 BCE he was entrusted with organizing public games alongside Augustus's stepson Tiberius. Marcellus was then married to Augustus' daughter Julia, who was not yet 14 years old, indicating how quickly Augustus pushed for dynastic succession. Marcellus was further privileged in 24 BCE when the Senate decreed that he could vote in the Senate with the rank of a praetor and that he could become consul 10 years before the legal minimum age. This was seen as the first step toward a dynastic succession, something that did not fit well with the image of a restored republic. Officially, however, Augustus received new honors from the Senate after the Spanish campaign and before his return to Rome. The Senate granted him a dispensation from all legal limitations on his authority when he sought their approval for announcing a cash gift to the people of Rome. These developments likely did not bother the general population much, but they were of great concern to the ruling class. Despite this, there was no space for a broad opposition movement. For Augustus, this was a stressful time, and his already fragile health deteriorated further. He believed he was near death and made preparations in case he died. Everyone expected that Marcellus would be named heir, but Augustus refrained from formally designating him. Agrippa, Augustus' closest friend and most trusted ally, could not be ignored. And Augustus also had to consider the appearance of respecting the consular constitution. In a key move, Augustus handed Agrippa his signet ring, entrusting him with control over his wealth and the family's vast network of clients. However, he entrusted the state papers, including military and financial records, to his co-consul Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, giving him temporary leadership of the state. Augustus knew that the time had not yet come to openly link the state's leadership with dynastic succession. As it turned out, Augustus recovered, but Marcellus died despite the efforts of the famous physician Antonius Musa. His death temporarily ended speculation about dynastic succession. Augustus realized he had to end the practice of holding one of the two consulships permanently, as his offer to let others hold the second consulship annually had not been accepted. In June 23 BCE, Augustus resigned from the consulship. Although he gave up two important powers, the right to convene the Senate and propose legislation, and the authority to govern senatorial provinces, he received new compensations. Augustus was granted overarching proconsular authority, imperium proconsular maius, over the provinces, along with lifelong tribunician power. This allowed him to intervene across the entire empire, with authority that was geographically and temporally unlimited. However, he could not solve every problem alone. He couldn't be in the west and the east at the same time, nor could he leave Rome entirely to its own devices. Augustus needed someone to share his authority, and his choice fell on Agrippa. In 23 BCE, Agrippa was granted equal proconsular authority over the eastern part of the empire, a legal status equal to that of Augustus himself. Even with these changes, the constitutional crisis was not over. The continuation of the crisis was triggered by a plague. As always in such cases, ominous signs were interpreted by the masses as divine anger, believing that Augustus's resignation from the consulship had angered the gods. Violent protests broke out, demanding that Augustus be named dictator and be put in charge of the grain supply for the capital. The Senate was besieged by the mob, which threatened to burn the building unless Augustus was appointed dictator. Augustus found himself in a difficult position. He needed to maintain good relations with the Senate, and above all, the shadow of Caesar's dictatorship loomed over him. Augustus refused the extraordinary powers offered to him, courageously resisting the demands of the mob. He also rejected the idea of holding the consulship year after year for life. Had he accepted either, he would have undermined the concept he had begun with his resignation from the consulship. Restraint became the hallmark of Augustus's public image in Rome. This included his decision to leave Rome in the autumn of 22 BCE for a 3-year stay in Sicily and the Greek East. Having withdrawn from the key office of consul, he was testing the waters to see if Rome could maintain a functioning government without him. But no sooner had Augustus left than violent unrest broke out during the consular elections. Augustus's primary goal in the East was to demonstrate Roman superiority over the Parthian Empire. In autumn 20th BCE, Augustus set sail for his return and arrived back in Rome on October 12th, 19th BCE. The city had again been rocked by violent election riots. A fierce struggle for the second consulship continued into the next year. Augustus's word ultimately resolved the situation, proving that only his authority could prevent chaos in Rome. The unrest and the failed conspiracy led to Augustus receiving lifelong consular powers without holding the office itself. His role, and that of future emperors, was now clearly defined. With victories in the East and order restored in Rome, Augustus laid the groundwork for a historical narrative that portrayed him as the savior of Roman history, the man who fulfilled Rome's destiny of world domination and restored peace and harmony. This narrative glorified Augustus and served as a practical political tool. Augustus played a significant role in shaping this version of history, and he had the willing support of the great poets of his time, especially Virgil and Horace. By the time of the grand secular games in 17 BCE, all of Spain could be considered fully conquered. However, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Balkans still lacked secure borders. Similar to what had happened in Pannonia and Dalmatia, the introduction of taxes and the recruitment of young indigenous men into the Roman army created the conditions for the uprising in Germania in 9 AD. The key figure in this rebellion was a Germanic nobleman known in Roman sources as Arminius. He had been a leader of a Germanic tribal contingent in Roman service and had been granted Roman citizenship and the status of equestrian. Arminius lured the Roman commander Varus and his army into a trap. Contrary to popular belief, the ambush did not take place in the Teutoburg forest, but rather in the Wiehengebirge hills to the north. One of the locations where the desperate battle of the Roman legions took place has been archaeologically identified at Calcries Hill, a narrow passage between the foot of the hill and the surrounding swamps. The destruction of the Roman army occurred not in a pitched battle, but during a 4-day death march. Calcries was likely one of the last stations of the march, but it seems improbable that an army of 20,000 men could have been completely annihilated there alone. Nevertheless, some survivors reached the Rhine and reported what had happened. When the news reached Rome, it caused a massive shock. Augustus was so grief-stricken that he let his beard and hair grow in mourning for months, repeatedly hitting his head against a door and crying, "Varus, give me back my legions!" The Roman army's total strength fell from 28 legions to 25, as the destroyed legions could not be reconstituted. Precautionary measures were taken in Rome to guard against potential unrest. Roman military camps and settlements in Germania were abandoned, and Tiberius was once again placed in command of the Rhine army. The idea of provincializing Germania was abandoned, and even the continuation of the war after Augustus's death in 15 and 16 AD did not change this. After more than a quarter century of intense fighting, the expansion of the Roman Empire had reached its limits. Augustus had come to power with the help of the army, buying the soldiers' loyalty through bribes, but in doing so, he had seriously undermined military discipline. After eliminating all his rivals, he became the restorer of this discipline. No longer did he greet the soldiers with the friendly address of comrades. Instead, he distanced himself and addressed them simply as soldiers. The strict discipline of the Roman army was reinstated with full force. Units that failed in battle were subjected to the harsh punishment of decimation. Soldiers and officers who committed offenses were punished and, in some cases, dishonorably discharged. Augustus made it clear that he was the absolute commander of the army and tolerated no competition for the soldiers' favor. Only his closest allies, such as his son-in-law Agrippa, his stepsons Tiberius and Drusus, and a few trusted followers, were allowed to lead large military forces. With great effort, Augustus managed to lay the foundations for the professional army of the imperial era and establish a veteran support system that did not require violent disruptions of property rights. The size of the professional army had to be determined to balance the needs of border security and expansion with the resources of the empire. By the end of the civil wars, over 60 legions existed, but only 28 remained under arms. After the annexation of Galatia, one more legion was added, the 22nd Deiotariana, named after King Deiotarus, who had formed it in the Roman style. Following the defeat suffered by Marcus Lollius in Gaul, the severely weakened 5th Gallica Legion was disbanded, bringing the army's total back to 28 legions, each with a nominal strength of about 500 men, amounting to a total of roughly 160,000 legionaries. In addition to the legions, auxiliary troops, known as auxilia, consisted of cavalry and infantry units of 500 to 1,000 men, mostly made up of non-citizens, often recruited from recently conquered tribes. This system reinforced the Roman citizen army and provided a safeguard for the new Roman rule by employing the military-age population outside their homeland. Additionally, tribal contingents from the army's operational areas were recruited for support, sometimes in large numbers. However, this practice proved to be a significant security risk in Dalmatia, Pannonia, and Germania. The Pannonian-Dalmatian revolt broke out when the manpower of Illyria, totaling 80 tribal contingents, was mobilized for a planned attack on the Marcomanni kingdom. The destruction of the legions in Germania was preceded by the defection of Germanic auxiliaries led by Arminius. Emergency measures for replacement troops became necessary. Wealthy citizens were required to provide combat-ready slaves who served in specially formed units of freedmen. Along with the creation of a professional army, the length of service gradually increased, and the system of veteran support evolved. In 13 BC, after returning to Rome from Gaul, Augustus raised the issue in the Senate. The last major veteran settlement had taken place in 14 BC, when Augustus had again purchased land with his own funds, as he had after the Battle of Actium. In his Res Gestae, he devoted a special section to this aspect of his rule, listing the various colonies of veterans he had founded throughout the empire. From Africa and Sicily to Macedonia, the 2 Spanish provinces, Asia, Syria, and several Gaulish and Pisidian regions. In Italy alone, 28 colonies had been established during his lifetime, all of which were flourishing and densely populated. The founding of veteran colonies relieved pressure on Italy, but land was still scarce in the provinces, and settlements like those of 30, 29, and 14 BC required vast sums of money and likely caused numerous conflicts. To ease the situation, Augustus proposed in his accountability report that soldiers of the Praetorian Guard should serve for 12 years and legionaries for 16 years before regular discharge. The veterans would no longer receive land, but rather a monetary settlement. However, this funding could not come from provincial taxes, as the provinces were already heavily burdened with the costs of maintaining the active army. The base pay for a simple legionary was 900 sesterces per year, and with an army of 160,000 legionaries, the total cost reached 144 million sesterces annually. Auxiliary forces, whose numbers we cannot precisely estimate, also added to the army's financial burden. Given the financial strain, Augustus initially covered the costs from his own wealth, contributing 400 million sesterces between 7 and 2 BC. Voluntary contributions from client kings and communities were welcomed, but Augustus refused donations from private individuals. However, private funding was only a temporary solution, and even Augustus' vast personal fortune could not sustain the new system of veteran support indefinitely. The solution came during a financial and recruitment crisis in 6 AD. The service time was extended to 16 years for praetorians and 20 years for legionaries. The retirement bonus for honorable discharge after the completed service was set at 20,000 sesterces for praetorians and 12,000 for legionaries. The challenge, however, was finding a sustainable source of funds for the ongoing costs of this pension system. Cassius Dio describes how Augustus addressed this issue. Given that voluntary donations, compared to the necessary funds, were insignificant and a permanent income source was needed, Augustus instructed the senators to individually propose revenue sources. They were to write their suggestions on a paper and submit them for his review, not because Augustus had no plan of his own, but so he could more effectively persuade them to adopt the solution he had in mind. When everyone suggested different solutions, Augustus approved none of them. Instead, he imposed a 5% inheritance tax on bequests and legacies left to anyone other than close relatives or the very poor. This new tax increased revenues, while Augustus reduced expenditures through the efforts of 3 consulars, chosen by lot, who cut or eliminated certain costs. Augustus provided an initial fund of 170 million sesterces, which was equivalent to the yearly pay of all ordinary legionaries. This new military treasury, funded by the inheritance tax, replaced Augustus's private wealth as the source for paying the soldiers. However, the heavy losses in Pannonia and Germania soon tested this solution. Soldiers had to serve longer than 20 years, and discipline had to be maintained with a firm hand. After Augustus's death, this tension erupted into mutinies along the Rhine and Danube. Soldiers complained that they were serving for as long as 30 to 40 years, and even veterans were being kept in special units. The situation was so difficult that Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and successor, remarked that he felt like he was holding a wolf by the ears. However, the crisis was eventually resolved. Despite these challenges, Augustus had successfully laid the groundwork for the imperial professional army and a veteran support system that avoided violent disruptions to property rights. By the end of Augustus' reign, the Roman Empire's provinces were divided as follows. The senatorial provinces were Sicily, Africa Proconsularis, Asia, Bithynia, Pontus in Asia Minor, Baetica in southern Spain, Narbonensis in southern Gaul, Macedonia and Achaia in the southern Balkans, Cyprus and the double province of Crete and Cyrene. Augustus controlled the imperial provinces, which included Tarraconensis and Lusitania on the Iberian Peninsula, Gallia Lugdunensis, Belgica and Aquitania in Gaul, Illyricum, and the newly conquered Pannonian territories in the Balkans, the large province of Galatia in Central Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. In these imperial provinces, as in Egypt, prefects from the equestrian order held military command and led civil administration. Augustus held an overarching imperium that allowed him to intervene in the governance of senatorial provinces, a power he had used when necessary. Augustus had a vast responsibility across the entire Roman Empire, and at times he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of duties. Upon hearing that Alexander the Great, after conquering the Persian Empire, didn't know what to do next, Augustus supposedly asked, "Did Alexander not consider it a more difficult task to organize an empire than to win it?" Augustus's reign was dedicated to organizing and stabilizing the empire. This explains why he relied on deputies to handle many regions, such as Agrippa, who was essential to Augustus in managing large tasks like the census and land surveys that were used to establish tax bases. These efforts led to the creation of Agrippa's famous world map, which was displayed posthumously in the Porticus of Agrippa. In newly established provinces where taxation was a novel concept, such as Gaul, Germania, Illyricum and Pannonia, the introduction of Roman taxes led to uprisings. Similarly, when Augustus deposed Archelaus, the ethnarch of Judea, Samaria and Idumea, and annexed these regions to the larger province of Syria under military governance, it triggered resistance. This occasion is referenced in the Gospel of Luke as the census decreed by Caesar Augustus that led to the nativity of Jesus. The Roman census in Judea, mentioned in the nativity story, was not a global event, nor the first of its kind, as Luke's account symbolically links Augustus's unification of the world with the birth of Christ. The imposition of Roman taxation in Judea also sparked a religiously fueled resistance against pagan rule, though Augustus successfully implemented the tax system almost everywhere except in Germania. Augustus fought tirelessly against corruption and abuse of power, but he was unable to eradicate these issues entirely, just as his successors couldn't. One of the worst abuses was the magistrate's authority to impose physical punishments or even the death penalty without a trial. This is how Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. In 12 AD, the proconsul of Asia, Lucius Valerius Messala committed a massacre, boasting about his excessive use of power. Augustus responded by teaching Volusus that he was not an absolute ruler, and the proconsul was later prosecuted for extortion in Rome. Through his efforts, Augustus earned the trust and loyalty of the provincial populations, who increasingly turned to him for justice, fearing that local officials might distort the law. This created a reputation for Augustus as a protector of fairness and justice, which contributed significantly to his authority. The praise and gratitude directed toward Augustus as the savior of the empire found expression in a flood of honors, culminating in the so-called Imperial Cult. This cult, rooted in the Hellenistic tradition, recognized the divine power manifesting through the emperor's extraordinary achievements. Augustus was worshipped as a god, especially in the East, and this practice spread to the West as well. Before his death, Augustus received honors akin to those given to a god, such as when sailors and passengers in the harbor of Puteoli hailed him as a deity. His divine presence, which many believed was evident in his benevolent rule, was complemented by the collective vow. Augustus was not only the founder of the Roman Empire, but also a master of political stabilization. In a time of great upheaval, he successfully consolidated the empire by balancing tradition with reform. He understood that power is maintained not only through military strength, but also through skilled diplomacy, economic stability, and public trust. In today's world, Augustus reminds us of the importance of leadership with vision and a long-term plan. His ability to implement change while retaining the trust of the people remains a timeless example of effective governance. Augustus's leadership resonates today as a model of how to navigate complex political landscapes. He inherited a fractured republic, marred by civil wars and unrest, and transformed it into a stable empire that endured for centuries. His focus on infrastructure, creating jobs, and reviving the economy can be likened to modern efforts at nation-building and economic reform. Additionally, Augustus was keenly aware of the power of image and messaging, understanding that public perception is crucial for maintaining authority, a lesson today's leaders in politics and business still follow. His legacy teaches that true leadership lies in the balance between strength, adaptability, and the capacity to inspire loyalty and unity in a diverse society.